Russia is waging war on Ukraine for over 44 months, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is the Bild Situation Room. We return now to the dramatic situation around Ukraine's former major city, Pokrovsk. According to reports from Ukrainian map makers, specifically the Deep State Map Service, Russian troops have continued to advance further into the city center. Let's take a look at the color coding here right away. Pokrovsk, yes, already contested in at least 80% of the urban area. However, and we can see this from this red line that now extends all the way into the city center, also according to Ukrainian reports, or at least according to pro-Ukrainian reports, the Ukrainian general staff may see it differently, but the Russians have now pushed into the city center and have also established positions there. We're now observing the dark red zones, which clearly indicates it's no longer simply about soldiers who are just hunting for Ukrainians to kill or hiding out there, but the Russians have firmly established themselves in these parts of the city and have also set up supply chains there. And we see that from the Russian side here via Svirove, for example, but also from the south, there are several logistical options, so to speak, for establishing a foothold there. Ukraine, on the other hand, has a massive problem that grows bigger every day. We can clearly see that the situation is not only deteriorating in Pokrovsk, but also across this vast area we're looking at on the right-hand side. For example, just from here down near Lysivka, there are still hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers holding the front line, who are actively and very successfully holding that front, and who, based on the current situation, would now have to withdraw at least 13 kilometers from this area. First via Myrnohrad and then through this narrow bottleneck up here, where Russian forces have already pushed in from both sides to get out of this area. All in all, according to our information, there are about 8,000 Ukrainian soldiers active here in these areas, and it appears that several thousand of them are close to being encircled. Virtually surrounded, not completely. We don't see it on the ground, but the drone situation, that corner up there, is only 3 kilometers, which is nothing for the Russian army's kamikaze drones. The drone situation here is so critical that we can already speak of an operational encirclement involving several thousand Ukrainian soldiers on the ground. Crucially, even if the encirclement isn't completed on the ground yet, and the Russians are doing everything to ensure this encirclement, or at least this critical situation here, remains by specifically attacking the supply lines. And these attacks on the supply lines, and Ukraine basically has just a single option to even maintain logistics here. Let's take a quick look at the map, namely to approach from the northwest. These attacks on logistics continue. Let's look at the whole thing again on the map from a bit further away. Namely, what we want to look at is, for one, the massive Russian attacks on vehicles of the Ukrainian army that are moving through this area. It's relatively rural, situated between Rudinsky, Hrishin and Pokrovsk to the south. However, there are numerous small roads where the Ukrainians are attempting to push forward towards Pokrovsk, either by moving along wooded areas or, as mentioned, by using very minor roads. And next we'll examine the situation in Biletske. It was a town of 7,000 people, located quite far north of Pokrovsk, at least 15 kilometers away, but we will be taking a closer look at it shortly. What the Russians are doing to disrupt these logistic hubs, that is to say, these support centers for Ukraine, from which you can relatively safely, so to speak, still support Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, to then attack these centers. We begin, as mentioned, with the situation on the small supply roads, and we had already indicated it, or rather you can see it quite clearly. The Russians are operating very heavily in this area with their own fiber optic guided drones, and we can observe that a significant number of Ukrainian vehicles are being destroyed. That's all supposed to have happened around the Pokrovsk area, at least that's what the Russians are claiming. Of course, we can't identify every single forest in this area, but we can clearly see the Ukrainians are using these makeshift roads that run along the ridges of the forests to move from A to B here. And there too, the Russians are extremely active and are in fact managing to attack a large portion of the logistics. Experts are citing a 75% vehicle loss rate, and this applies equally to both sides of the conflict. When they approach the front, 75% of the vehicles are lost, only about 25% manage to come back out functional, either because they are not attacked or because they survive the attack. And so we are really seeing major logistic problems on the Ukrainian side, which then means they are essentially forced to rely almost entirely on foot soldiers, on infantrymen, for their operational needs and capabilities. In order to supply their troops, that means all ammunition, all fuel, all food has to be transported on foot, has to be carried a distance of several kilometers, up to 10 kilometers, in order to get here in the direction of Pokrovsk. We are actually seeing one of the consequences of this massive Russian deployment of fiber optic drones, which results in this fiber optic pollution we are currently observing right here. This is also a forest near Pokrovsk. We see the tracks here, and I hope that's clear. All this shiny stuff you see here in the sunlight, that's all fiber optic cables That means these are all those super thin cables that were used mostly by Russian drones to strike right here to attack Ukraine's logistical supply routes or the neighboring cities, specifically Rodinske, Biletske, and Dobropilya. And we see the truly insane situation. There are literally thousands upon thousands. Why? Because the Russians are easily deploying 1,000 kamikaze drones per day just in this area alone. We know that roughly 60% of Russian offensive movements are currently concentrated on Pokrovsk, and therefore we see that basically the entire landscape here is polluted with fiber optic cables. And this is indeed a problem because this fiber optic cable partially dissolves and then of course gets washed into the soil with the rain. This is a problem that, regardless of whether the Russians capture it or the Ukrainians are able to liberate it, will continue to pollute and thereby contaminate this area for years. As I said, we're going further north to Biletske, a few kilometers up. Here we see what happened to this small town, formerly 7,700 inhabitants, through exactly these Russian attacks. And again, we are not in Pokrovsk here. We are 15 kilometers north of Pokrovsk, in a town that has never been entered by the Russians. And this is what this town looks like before the first Russian soldier sets foot on it. So that means we have complete destruction, we have complete depopulation. It is not possible for any person to continue living here. So whatever the Russians claim to be liberating will just become a wasteland of rubble that they can take ideological pleasure in. But in the end, it will be destroyed by their own actions. That they've taken these territories, but there will be no life left in them for years to come. We're basically seeing the very latest attacks that have just occurred here. West of Pokrovsk, or to the northwest of it, located in that specific area, we observed on the map the region we were just discussing moments ago on the screen that was displayed there. So all the Ukrainian logistics, meaning the support towards Pokrovsk, is trying to be concentrated there, where, of course, until recently, thousands of civilians were still living. But all of that is no longer possible now. We see it. The Russians, from a distance, from at least 15 kilometers away, have destroyed virtually every single residential building in Biletske with their glide bombs, and in doing so, have not only made it very difficult for the Ukrainian soldiers to gain a foothold here, but have also rendered it completely and utterly impossible for the Ukrainian civilian population in this former small town to continue living here any longer. The situation is critical for Ukrainian defenders, not only around Pokrovsk, but also in Kharkiv, where it's worsening. We have a new video from Kupiansk, a formerly very important city in the eastern part of the Kharkiv region. And this video shows us from the Ukrainian perspective that the houses in the city center are by now under Russian control, as we can see here in the city center, that these high-rise buildings in the center of Kupiansk are occupied. That an attack there is only possible now from a distance, specifically by using drones, and that the dramatic thing, as we'll see shortly, is that these houses we've just been looking at, which were attacked, are located right by the former bridge, positioned across the Oskil River. But that means the only option for the areas east of Kupiansk, half the city lies on the eastern bank of the Oskil, but also for the other areas that are still under Ukrainian control there, to continue supplying them. Let's look at the whole thing on the map, and we see that the Russians also want to capture more of Kharkiv. They're also pushing in Kharkiv and Vovchansk. As we just saw, they're advancing slowly but steadily. And this here is the situation we just described. We can see this bridge in the middle of the city relatively well. The bridge leads right over the Oskil River. I hope you can recognize it. It flows here from south to north. That was the main supply route for the Ukrainian troops on the east bank. This bridge is now at least yellow, if not actually completely red. We can see that the red zone now reaches right up to it. Approximately, well, what is that? About 40% of Kupiansk is now under Russian control. And the issue is that we now have a large area here of, well, what would you say that is roughly? It's about 10 by 20 kilometers, which can hardly be supplied anymore. And this area is at risk of being cut off with every meter, with every house and every block that the Russians advance further south into Kupiansk. And therefore it also looks as though in the eastern part of the Kharkiv region, if the momentum continues, meaning if Kupiansk is further captured from north to south, the Ukrainians will have to conduct a withdrawal to the secondary defensive line situated in the south, or otherwise face total encirclement and being taken captive. Ultimately, any outcome would lead to serious casualties or soldiers being taken prisoners. None of this should obscure the fact that the Russian army continues to suffer massive and heavy losses each and every day. We have new videos from Toretsk, a city of 31,000 that was completely conquered and destroyed by the Russian army. And here we can see that the Ukrainians are also using FPV drones, that they are also using these typical loitering munition drones. We'd only seen that from the Russians. Here we see this Desert Cross again. A vehicle from China, an inexpensive vehicle, which the Russians are using without any armor. It's being tracked now, and you can focus your attention not just on the vehicle, since it's about to be destroyed, but also on what the general state of Toretsk looks like by now. That means this is what it looks like. This is how the city has been completely destroyed. This is precisely the fate that threatens Ukrainian cities once the Russians have gained a foothold there. And we are now seeing the attack on this small vehicle. One soldier jumps out at the last moment. The other is then accordingly... They're also hit. Here's another rocket launcher that was hiding, or a truck, not quite clear, that was hiding in a house and gets hit here. And we see the Ukrainians who are observing and engaging the target from their concealed positions. They manage time and again to attack with their kamikaze drones, to attack the Russians where they've already gained a foothold, where they can no longer move freely. And here we see various trucks and also quads attacked in the Toretsk region. Again, it's clearly visible here, and I find it genuinely impressive every time. When you look at the situation, you can see it. These are the former residential buildings. That's what they look like today. It's completely impossible to live there. And to be honest, the Russians don't even try. They just drive through, using these cities as logistic centers, as supply bases to move their soldiers towards the front from there. That seems to be enough for them. That must be their definition of liberation then. And there's very little that can effectively be done against these drones. The Ukrainians are using shotguns to counter the fiber optic ones, for instance. We know that the Russians very much rely on massive armor, and we had already seen one of these bristle tanks in recent days and are seeing it again today in a new video. Because here you can see truly a real monster on which these steel constructions, we talked about this recently, where approximately 900 per tank, 80 centimeters long, a kind of steel flowers or steel bristles were installed. What we see here underneath was probably once a T-80 BVM, that is a relatively modern Russian battle tank, which now looks like this. And we can see quite clearly that efforts are being made here on the front side. Someone noticed it even better with the scooter, that countermeasures are being taken against mines, that defensive work is underway against these fiber optic guided FPV drones. And up at the very top we can see the jammer, a massive jammer, and I'm also not sure how healthy it is for the tank's crew to live under that for an extended period. However, it's supposed to help against radio-controlled drones. And so we see that the Russians are trying to build these monstrosities. And again, very importantly, I think we had it about a year or so ago. We probably even chuckled about it back then, saying, what are these strange-looking things? It works, and this must be stated very clearly. Its purpose is to move infantry from point A to point B. Of course, this vehicle no longer functions as a tank, but it still works at least as an armored bus. And that's all the Russians need for their strategy. Finally, we want to take a look at ranged attacks, specifically the ranged attacks from both sides. We'll begin our discussion with the FP2 drone, a modified variant of the Ukrainian Army's original FP1 model. We remember the FP1 was manufactured by Firepoint, was a drone with a range of about 1,400 kilometers, similar to the Lutej drone, but with a warhead of only about 50 kilos. That's something, but relatively minor. The FP2 we're about to see in action is a short-range variant of it. That means here the large explosive charge was increased, actually growing from 50 to 105 kilos. However, the drone's range has decreased from 1,400 to 200 kilometers as a result. And we'll see it on its final approach now, and just how large it really is. I'm really hoping I can capture it here. Here we see it. So this is one of those FP2 drones currently making its final approach. We can see the wings fairly clearly, and we see the attack on this house. And what we see primarily is the massive explosion that's triggered here by a small drone, yet one equipped with a very large warhead. These are all attacks relatively far behind the front lines, precisely in the occupied territories of southeastern Ukraine. That's the total extent of what the SBU has revealed in publishing this video. And we see the attacks always from the perspective of the respective drones. So we also see, yes, there is a targeting system, albeit a relatively simple one. And we then immediately see from another perspective that these attacks were indeed capable of igniting relatively significant and large-scale fires. Here we see it, I believe. So here we're basically looking at the city from above with various fire hotspots that were allegedly at least started by these drones. Here we see again the drone's approach towards a larger building here in the center of a city. That means we can actually assume that FP, meaning Firepoint, currently has at least a few drones at its disposal that are fully operational. With the FP5, the so-called Flamingo, the questions are still very big, whether they're actually deployed regularly, whether they're being built in large numbers. However, with the smaller variants, namely the FP1 and FP2 drones, we can be relatively certain that they're actually being used on a daily basis now. And it's not only within Ukraine that the Ukrainian army continues to strike to attack the occupied territories, but also outside. We have now obtained exclusive footage showing a new attack on the oil port of Tuapse on the Black Sea. Here we're seeing footage from the night before last, showing the air defense in Tuapse as it tried to shoot down the Ukrainian drones. And it's interesting, in Germany they ask what happens when those projectiles fall back down. In Russia, that seems to be completely irrelevant. Even over major cities, thousands of shots are just fired into the sky in the hope of shooting something down. Of course, all these projectiles will eventually come back down to the ground and could theoretically injure people. However, the risk calculation does seem to be different, and here we see the fire that subsequently broke out at the oil port in Tuapse, a city on the Black Sea. As we said, it's quite a distance from the Ukrainian front. At the end, we also have footage, in this case firm satellite recordings, that locate the fires, confirming the whole thing. Yes, it clearly burned there at the oil terminal, and here we have another photo that was also geolocated, not by us, but by experts on social media, which now clearly indicate there are at least 3 fires in 3 separate locations following the Ukrainian strike on Tuapse. And this, of course, is something we naturally want to look at on the map to see how far the Ukrainian drones are now being deployed. And we can see in Tuapse, oil and gas from the Caucasus is processed and is then also partly exported onward, very much like the situation in Novorossiysk. Whether Russia still does this much is the next question. They've had fuel supply issues. And we can also state that Ukraine most likely conducted this drone attack once more from the southwestern region of the country, navigating a flight path that circumvented Crimea before ultimately carrying out the strike in that location. That means overall we can assume that the drones deployed in this attack had a range of approximately 800 to over 1,000 kilometers to reach Tuapse. However, Russia is also still very active with its kamikaze drones, though, and that's the difference, there are repeated civilian casualties. And it at least looks as if Russia is also very deliberately attacking civilian areas. We have now just received new footage coming from Sumy, a city in the northeastern part of Ukraine. We're now seeing a local resident who is simply filming what happened caused by this Shahed 136 or Guran 2 or whatever the Russians call it. Specifically, that 3 floors were simply ripped out of this apartment block. We have these massive attacks almost every night, sometimes 100 drones, sometimes 700, targeting Ukrainian cities. Every single night we see civilian casualties and injuries occurring in Ukraine, and that should show us once again, even though we show it relatively rarely, it is a daily phenomenon, the Russian terror against the Ukrainian civilian population, and we continue to witness time and again these at least accidental, if not intentional, attacks on Ukrainian civilian areas, and clearly civilian buildings. These attacks continue, and that is precisely the reason, in fact the sole reason, why Ukraine must continue to fight back in eastern Ukraine, and why it must keep striking Russian targets both in retaliation and for clearly defined strategic purposes that are essential to win the war.